All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim O'Donnell. I'm Professor of Marine Sciences at UConn, and I'm lead PI on this project, Identifying Community Needs-Based Adaptation and Resilience Priorities in the Northeast. And I want to thank everyone for participating, and particularly the co-PIs and the staff at CIRCA. And I'll tell you more about them in a minute. Today, I'm just going to introduce the idea of the program, the NSF's R2I2 initiative, and then I'll outline our project, and then you'll hear some more interesting stuff from the co-PIs who are going to illustrate some example initiatives that we are considering undertaking as part of this program. So the Regional Resilience Innovation Incubator Program, or the R2I2, was launched by NSF about a year ago as a research proposal competition. The idea was to use earth sciences to help address the problems of resilience in the United States, and I guess more broadly around the world too. The goal of the program really is pretty practical. It's a little different from the regular NSF priorities, which are about fundamental research. But the idea is to use recent advances and perhaps new advances in earth sciences to help society address serious problems. It's got two phases. This is phase one. Phase one is about planning and organizing teams that would otherwise not be in existence to do interdisciplinary programs. Next one, please.
Jim, your camera's off too, if you want to turn it on.
Oh, yeah, thanks.
No problem.
Yeah, this is Jim O'Donnell. And the goal of the initiative was to try and fund programs in each of these regions. These are the National Climate Assessment Zones. And then the numbers here, the number of programs that they actually funded in each of these zones. There are 4 in the Northeast, of which we are one. And then you can see that they're sort of spread around. And the red star is what they call the national office for this initiative. They funded the University of Minnesota to try and coordinate amongst the programs that were funded across the United States. Next one. Yeah, the staff are shown in the picture. The NSF staff are shown in the picture over here. They're from the Geosciences Directorate and the Technology Incubation Program Initiative. And they are responsible for these programs. And ours is so go back one. Ours is managed by Sri Mishra in Geosciences. The schedule from their perspective is in the bottom here. We're in year one, and the year one there we have about actually $500,000 for year one and year two. And that's in green here, and that illustrates phase one. And that's about meetings and coordination and planning. And at the end of phase one, the original idea was that teams that were funded for phase one would produce proposals for phase two, which would be up to $10 million in 5 years to conduct programs that were developed and prioritized in the phase one initiative. Now, phase two is not definite at the moment, I understand. I learned earlier this week that they're still trying to organize whether they're still going to go ahead with that. So the reason to participate and continue with this there's really 2 reasons. One is to produce a proposal that would be competitive with others around the country in phase two. But in addition, there is opportunities to produce other proposals that may be collaborative and establish new links with other programs around the region. And I'm hoping that payoff will be as great as the phase two proposal as well. Okay, next one. So what we proposed was to develop a prioritized list of climate challenges that are facing regional municipalities that can be addressed with modern geosciences. Then to develop solutions and a strategy to develop and demonstrate them. Third part here is an assessment of the regional needs for education and training in geosciences and geosciences-related fields that would help address and sustain the initiatives that we undertake and develop in a phase 2 initiative, and then make it sustainable. Finally, this number 5 is a plan to organize, design a staffing and a funding kind of process which would sustain regional collaborations that emerge from this initiative. So those are the long-term goals. Next one. And this is how we organized it in our proposal. And this is a little, not really very helpful, but the main institutions that are leading it are listed on the right here. That's the University of Connecticut and the team at CIRCA, the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation, the University of Maine, Brooklyn College at CUNY, and Stevens Institute of Technology. Now, I've got 3 boxes here. The bottom ones show the institutions. The middle ones show the volunteers who want to participate and help us fulfill this goal of establishing new collaborations that can address significant and impactful problems in our region. And then the top shows how I envision us getting to the deliverables, which is several working groups of which will be coordinated and organized and supported by people who are getting paid by the initiative from CIRCA and from the other institutions, but populated and inspired by you guys. Next one. And here's our schedule. This is from the proposal, so it hasn't really adapted to the realities of really getting work done. The red arrow shows where we are right now. We're in phase 1. Phase 1, step 1. We're developing a project team. Then the next section that you'll be involved in probably are in working groups. We anticipate, 5 or 6 or 8 or something of 5, 6, 7 people each to work collaboratively on a research theme. And we'll hear some more potential research themes in a few minutes. Next one. Then at the end of the first year, there'll be a report, and that will list the things that we've come up with as potential project themes, but they will have been evaluated and commented upon through this consultation step, which is 2, by people who are implementers and users. So, for example, contractors who work for towns and do engineering work and design work, and regulators who do permitting and funding decisions. And then again, around step 6, there's a project development workshop that we will hold. And people who are here will be involved in actually outlining proposal themes, with goals and hypotheses and budgets. And then at the end of the project in step 9 there, that's where we'll have a final project workshop, proposal workshop, in which the themes and ideas that we've developed and collaborated will be sorted through, and prioritized, will be included in the draft proposal. And that was where we were when we wrote. This is from the proposal, which was written about a year ago. Then there'll be a final report. But the initial idea the R2I2 office had was to have an RFP for phase 2, around the August of 2 years from now. Okay, next one. So here's the team of PIs, and some of them will be speaking later. Actually, most of them are speaking in a few minutes, and they include science engineers. John's a planner. Joe is a lawyer. Manos is an engineer, and Philip and Kim and Lauren, they're physical oceanographers, a bit like myself. Next one. And then there's the CIRCA staff who are making this workshop as effective as it can be, and they'll be helping with the advancing the workshops and the collating of information and the drafting of notes and sharing of information. Next one. And here's the agenda for today. So 9 to 9:30 is this bit, and I've got a few minutes. I'm going to take some questions in a minute. Then from 9:30 to 10, there'll be 3 grant themes. Those are potential ideas that will illustrate for you things that we've thought of, and hopefully will prompt you to be interested and prompt you to come up with alternatives or additional themes that we can discuss later. There'll be some questions at 9:45 to 9:55. Then there'll be 3 more themes discussed by volunteers, and then additional discussions. Then at 10:20 to 11, there's going to be something completely different. Right? That's a policy and implementation panel. Because some of our new science in that is potentially useful is obstructed from being implemented because of existing regulations, which are often backward-looking and require technologies and models and procedures that were developed in the 70s or 80s. And then there's other things that need to get developed and that are obstructed by the absence of regulations and policies. And so formulating things, policies and practices and laws even that would allow towns and municipalities to be more effective and quicker in implementing resilience, I think is something that we want to discuss. We've experienced some of these things, and Joel summarized that, and then there'll be discussion and opportunities for input. Finally, there'll be a general feedback and questions at the end of this 2-hour block, and a discussion of what comes next. Next one. So throughout this, we want to get input, and having a virtual thing that lasts 3 hours and outlines a 2-year program, $500,000 is a bit of a challenge. So we've got 2 ways of at least 3 ways, I guess, of getting input from you and logging it. One would be to enter your ideas and questions on this link through a Miro board. You can also type things in the chat, and you might not get an immediate response, but it'll get logged, and we'll consider it and include it in subsequent reports. And then you can, at the appropriate times, just put your hand up and chime in and ask a question. Okay, next one. Oh, one other thing. If you have any problems with that, just put. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, if you have problems with either the chat or the Miro thing, you can just put your hand up. Or so if it's a Miro problem, put it in the chat. If it's a chat problem, put your hand up and let us know if it's urgent. Okay, next one.
Next one starts with the research team. So I think we can take some questions right now to Jim about the R2I2 project and then the process.
Okay, so we can take some questions.
You can type his hand up or write in the chat. We'll be monitoring both.
Okay, Philip.
Well, you mentioned that we would look in phase 2 to collaborate across the country or something like that, but phase 2 will still be regional, right? These are still regional?
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to clarify that.
Phase 2 should be regional, I think the notion of the R2I2 national office is to try and help facilitate collaborations between project groups. That's one of their initiatives. Okay, anyone else? All right, anything in the chat yet?
Nothing in the chat yet, Jim.
All right. Is anybody else there?
Jim, maybe you can talk about the expectations from the TAP members.
Oh yeah, so yeah, the TAP, this I forget what TAP stands for, but it's people who are here today, more or less, and others of the same kind of interest and backgrounds. That is science and policy people interested in making geosciences more useful for resilience at the municipal level. So the opportunity to participate is in working groups to help to suggest and then develop and participate in working groups that would help develop projects that would potentially be in a proposal, or they could produce independent proposals. And I'm hoping that the characteristics of our phase 2 initiative will be teams which would address problems in using approaches that would not be able to be done by a single group alone. Right? The idea here is to stimulate new approaches and new teams. Now, that doesn't foreclose people, moving their own ideas forward with a smaller group of people as well. And hopefully both things will happen. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, well, if we don't have any other questions, maybe we should just move on to the more interesting stuff.
Okay. So my name is John Trzynski. As Jim mentioned, I'm one of the co-PIs on this proposal. I'm the Director of Resilience Planning at Circa, and work with municipalities across Connecticut. Definitely excited to collaborate with folks across the Northeast and, look at what we can learn from each other over the course of the next 2 years. So as Jim mentioned, the goal of this first year especially is to come up with a prioritized list of climate challenges that are shared across the Northeast region, and then start to develop some proposed solutions. Those solutions might be connected to particular sites that we could propose to work on in phase 2. But the initial proposal had suggested a list of challenges that are, likely to be major issues across the Northeast. So what we're going to do for the next hour or so is have pretty short presentations of some of the research themes that were laid out in the proposal. So each of the co-PIs is going to do about a 5-minute presentation. What is this challenge? What are some of the dynamics? What are some of the research questions? And then we'll do 3 of them, and then we'll have a chance to, have a discussion, questions, feedback, and then we'll do 3 more and move on from there. And as Jim mentioned, if you have thoughts, questions, you can throw them in the chat, or we have the Miro board where we've organized each of the different research themes that were initially proposed for this program. And you're welcome to, write your thoughts or questions in the Miro board. So with that, we're gonna kick it over to Kim for the first presentation of the first research theme.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Huguenard. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Awesome. Okay. So for the first theme under flooding, I'm going to be talking about flood hazard mapping. Not just what floods today, but how risk changes under future conditions, and how mitigation actually shows up in maps that towns use. And so in thinking about why this matters, and particularly from the Northeast perspective, flood losses are rising across the Northeast, and these are driven by sea level rise, heavier precipitation, and stronger storms. What we're seeing clearly, very clearly, is that these impacts are not evenly distributed. They disproportionately affect vulnerable communities, both coastal and then also inland. At the same time, these flood maps many municipalities rely on, and in particular, FEMA maps, they're backwards looking, and they underrepresent true and future flood exposure. They're designed for insurance and emergency response, and not necessarily for forward-looking planning. And so these flood maps are already embedded in zoning, capital planning, and permitting. And so if the maps are lagging reality, the decisions are also lagging reality too. So what's changed and what do we know? One big shift is that flooding is increasingly resulting from compounding drivers. So it's no longer just surge or just rainfall. It's kind of a combination of things. So think tides combining with storm surge, precipitation, river discharge, and draining all interacting together. So we do have state and national flood models, and they're typically built at scales that are too coarse for neighborhood level decisions. So what actually controls whether a street or a block floods are very, very local features. So think roads, culverts, tide gauges, marsh storage. And those controls often aren't resolved in these regional products. So that leaves us an opportunity in this R2I2 planning phase. And the opportunity here is to kind of bridge this gap between linking what exists in these regional and state scale models to what municipalities actually need in order to make decisions. So that includes mapping not only what is existing in flood risk, but what future and mitigated scenarios, evolving from kind of this basic binary flood zone map of flood versus no flooding to a more robust and graded flood risk. So thinking about how often these zones are flooding or what the inundation levels are, things like that. And critically, doing this in a way that supports use in planning, zoning, and capital investment, not just research. So if we move on to the next slide. So from a science perspective, the challenge is representing compound flooding processes at neighborhood scales in a way that's credible and defensible. So that means translating coarse models into high resolution inundation maps. So on scales of 1 to 2 meters. And being explicit about the uncertainty. So not hiding it, but characterizing it. It also means consistently incorporating future conditions like sea level rise and changing precipitation so that municipalities aren't using incompatible assumptions. So thinking about challenges, translating this into action, that's the harder challenge. So even good flood maps don't automatically translate into action. Towns need to know how these maps can be used in zoning, ordinances, and design standards. There's also a regulatory question. What standards make future condition flood maps defensible for policy and permitting? And finally, there's kind of a capacity issue. Local planners and engineers need to understand what the models can and cannot say. So otherwise, they either overtrust them or ignore them entirely. So next, we're going to move on to the next flooding theme, which is going to be about flood adaptation and modeling decisions. Lauren's muted.
I'm muted, sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Ross. I'm faculty at the University of Maine, and I'm going to present our second research theme, which is on, as Kim mentioned, flood adaptation, focusing on modeling and decisions. So starting off with why it matters in the Northeast in particular is that, well, we really need models and predictions to develop adaptation strategies for flooding. And for these to be usable, we need them to be accurate at project scales and also to include dynamic climate and geographic changes. However, there's a lack of local scale model development, as Kim mentioned, aimed to specifically inform planners, insurance programs, and emergency managers about the risk of flooding in many regions of the Northeast, in particular, smaller communities, rural communities, and this is working waterfront communities and also inland communities. So what's changed, sort of what we know really on what's been developed in the scientific front with this is that we now really understand the importance of compound drivers for flooding, as Kim mentioned in the previous presentation, but also land subsidence. And we now have the methodologies to be able to capture land subsidence, in particular with GPS and INSAR, which maps ground deformation using radar. We also have new measurement technologies that can be adopted to validate model performance in near real time. And all of this has allowed us to come up with model-based probabilistic flood assessments, which can be bolstered by new machine learning technologies and be used to help with decision-making for flood mitigation. So this provides us with some unique opportunities, some ideas for this NSF R2I2 proposal, going from phase 1 to phase 2, are taking these regional flood models that we have, translating those into hyperlocal models that can incorporate compound drivers, land subsidence, and even potentially drainage networks to really better our flood modeling. We can also then improve hyperlocal models by using new measurement technologies and even automatically integrate observing system data streams into models. Having both highly validated models and measurements will allow us to train machine learning-based models that can help with decision trade-off. And machine learning-based models are great because you can have large ensembles of storm and flood events that can help come up with accurate or pretty accurate benefit cost ratios for planning. However, we do have some challenges. First of all, we really need to facilitate the development of these models, development, validation, and implementation. It needs to be designed to meet community and contractor needs. And so one of the solutions that we could have for this is standardizing modeling practices on a regional or local scale, and also providing training and technical assistance for those who are going to be using these models. We also have the challenge that there's computational uncertainty and expense of these probabilistic assessments for flood modeling, in particular, going to these hyperlocal scales, considering street scales, multiple drivers, and compound effects. So a potential solution would be to develop a sensor network that can provide us with baseline data just so that we can track changes, like understand the vital signs of the waterways in which we're working in, also validate our models at hyperlocal scales, and train machine learning-based models. But taking this from translation into action has its own challenges. So we really need to reduce the barriers to consistent modeling practices. But as we all know, there's many different modeling softwares. There's different output types. We visualize model outputs differently. And this will make standardization and development of error standards for models that we can use across the board, as well as training of personnel difficult. Also, having observation systems is great, and implementing those is great, but maintaining sensor networks in perpetuity with really valid QA/QC processes can be very costly and can be hard to get funding for. And then finally, machine learning-based models are only as good as the data that they're trained on, which makes data collection and model validation a top priority, sort of reinforcing those first two bullet points that I went on, that I talked about. So now I'm just going to hand it off to Philip for the last presentation in the flood section.
Thank you, Lauren and Kim. So a lot of what they've already spoken of translates well. The same modeling tools and the same solutions, or a different solution, is for real-time prediction to enable adaptation as storms are occurring. And so some of the same problems, motivate this work: sea level rise, a region with high exposure, in part due to land subsidence across the coastal Northeast at least, and increasing extreme rainfall. So what's changed that we know now, in addition to things we've already heard about, and some of this overlapping a little bit, the flood modeling's improved dramatically. We can include all these drivers in the flood models, and this has really been advancing year to year in the past decade or so. Dramatic improvement in the tools we have. So these same models that have been improved that could be applied for understanding risk, for adaptation assessment, can be applied for forecasting. So that's a real opportunity if we wrap all this together in an initiative to incubate this type of work across these three realms. In addition, we can think about rain nowcasting nowcasting. It's something that we're, wondering how we can incorporate that. At Stevens, we've run coastal flood forecasts or water level forecasts for 20 years now and gradually improved. But now this rainfall nowcasting opportunity, with the increasing realization that these rain floods are becoming more extreme, is another opportunity to utilize these same models and bring it together, because water's water. But as I'll speak to in the next slide, there's different challenges with rainfall forecasting. And lastly, there's certainly an improved ability to capture uncertainty through ensemble forecasting with the dynamic water models or with the machine learning models. And so that's another opportunity to leverage those advancements. So the vision that we have is that we could work with emergency management entities and residents on improving and creating and improving these forecast systems, and looking to how they could be scaled up more regionally. Also alerts and apps that people can have that buzz them when there's flooding coming, or send them an email if there's an outlook for the next week of a storm-driven flooding. We can create forecast and alert systems that have greater localization. I think a key question is, how do we differentiate from what NOAA is planning on doing? So it's important for us to interact with NOAA and define what our advances are and how we're different. And I think that could be focusing more on urban areas where NOAA, if they're trying to capture the whole country in their flooding products, so far they haven't had the same capacity when it comes to looking at smaller scale urbanized areas. So that's one opportunity we could pursue. And lastly, the question is, and I didn't write it down here, but I'm increasingly wondering if we also need to really bring in companies that could also work with us on incubating this work and making it more large scale. So we have to think about how to work with NOAA, but we also could leverage collaboration with companies who could maintain these models and help make them more available and easy to use. And maybe a standardization of models across the region could be a useful benefit, considering that there's the flood risk, the adaptation, and the forecasting where these models can be used similarly. Next slide. So getting into some of the challenges, the scale obviously is a big computational challenge. So we may not want to focus on the whole region. Like I said, we could focus on urban centers as one idea. The diversity of flooding and flood predictability is another topic that we could dig into more. Rain flooding, extreme rain flooding from supercells, like hope it happened during post-tropical cyclone Ida, can't be predicted 5 days in advance. It's something where the nowcasting, where there's radar data and data assimilation modeling, and which can be, it's not as useful to say there's a 2% chance of extreme rainfall in 5 days. Somebody doesn't know what to do with that. So that's where nowcasting can come in, and the flood diversity is a little bit of a challenge. If you want to have the same forecast system that sends out 5-day notifications of a impending tropical cyclone or storm, it's different than rainfall, extreme rain, downpour predictability and warnings that might just be possible on a matter of hours. And then in terms of translation to action, the accreditation, legal challenges. If universities are positioning ourselves as providers of the forecast, then it can lead to some legal dangers, and that's a challenge. Communicating ensemble forecasts and uncertainties is it's an area of ongoing research. NOAA is actually making strides, but I think that's there's still a lot of work to be done there for understanding how to package this information that is probabilistic, instead of just telling people it's going to rain or not rain, or giving simplistic language. And then lastly, collaboration versus differentiation with NOAA, I think, is another big question. So we'll have to interact with NOAA and interact with weather forecast offices to learn where there's a niche for us to fit in with our work. So I think now we open the floor to questions.
Okay. So as you heard, that the first three that we covered, there's a lot of issues surrounding flooding. And, these are kind of some of our initial ideas about what we should focus on and how we might address them. So we have about, 5 to 10 minutes if anybody has any feedback, questions, thoughts. Are we completely missing the boat? Feel free to unmute yourself and give us your thoughts. Don't make me start calling on people.
We don't have anything in the chat yet, John. We do have a couple responses in the Miro board for some of the prompts that we provided with the group. So one way to start might be anyone who's been writing into the Miro board, if you want to unmute and expand on what you've written. We can also share the Miro board on for the presentation view.
Who wants to go first? Joe?
I'll go first.
Oh,
too bad I beat you, Jim. The
Okay, go ahead, Joe.
so I did in my favorite theme that everyone's a policy person. So for each of you talked a little bit about something that I'll talk about later that had to do with communicating to the groups, the flood zones, how to distinguish between, the FEMA line, what's happening in your area. I'm wondering if you have a thought as to what's the most effective way to communicate your work to the people that have to make the decision itself.
We benefited with the forecasting. We benefit a lot from having warning systems, right? Email systems that go out, and in the end, through Sea Grant, I guess, is one way that we interact with communities, and through doing a survey of our users, because we get their email addresses when they sign up for email alerts. We've had workshops that Sea Grant helped manage under some separate NOAA funding, actually. But that's, getting connected with the communities was the starting point, and having a warning system, something where we get their email addresses, helped enable that. So now we've kind of learned a few communities that use our forecasting for emergency management. They have a whole list of tasks that they do when they see a water level above a certain level. So that's some of the things that we do to get more connected.
So I will say not a lot of ideas on the best way to communicate with communities about flood risk, but I know there's a lot of sensitivity around how to communicate with communities. And just anecdotally, I know that here in Maine, whenever we have messages that go out from the National Weather Service, they don't talk about they don't refer to flood risk as surges. I think they refer to it as flooding. Like there's some sensitivity around how messaging to communities. And I know that we have some social scientists on campus that have a lot of research into messaging on this. So I do think it's an active topic on just studying this in itself.
Got a hand up here from Kevin.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, or maybe it's less of a question, but more of a comment related to a couple of things that Philip was just saying. And first, let me just apologize. I joined the call quite late, so I didn't capture everything. But when you think about how you integrate with NOAA, I think it's key that as you're building out these tools, and if you are testing something in an urban center or multiple urban centers, the more you can rely on the input to whatever the tool or modeling that you're doing as part of the project, to the operational models that exist at NOAA. I think that's one of the most important ways to integrate, because I think that when my experience of engaging with communities in the New York City area is that there's just so many different tools out there. There's so many efforts that are trying to do things that are related to this, that the more that we can kind of not bring a new tool that's using different models that are informing it, but kind of building on the existing operational framework to show how you can use that information in different ways, or how you can better inform risk from flooding during events, I think would be one of the key ways to leverage connections with NOAA. So again, not really a question, but more of just a general comment.
So let me respond to that. I think that's a great point. And I mean, I think that we should, in this project, try and identify what the fundamental limitations to current technology are for making useful decisions and reliable decisions at the local level, right? So the tools that are available, especially from the federal government, tend to be national in scope, but the needs of many needs of towns are to define like how high something has to be in a particular zone, or what capacity it should have to carry rainfall, runoff, etc. And these things are not necessarily well predicted at the local level, and so towns are faced with building things that are too big or maybe not big enough. And how to advance that so that we can be more cost effective and reliable, I think is an area that research needs to advance.
I think Manos has his hand up.
Yeah, just 2 points. One is new technologies on SAR applications for flood inundation mapping have given us pretty good monitoring capabilities. That needs to be taken into consideration. Nowcasting now can be fully supported by SAR technology, and we are able to get inundation levels even at urban scale and even within vegetated conditions. The second point is the risk characterization. That's where we suffer the most in terms of compound flooding, and of course, how the changes in the precipitation IDFs are going to affect the non-stationarity basically on the characterization of risk is affecting our ability to design. So these are two critical areas because we've seen significant shifts in the IDFs. Actually, we have a conus-wide map showing where those shifts are. I'm not talking about climate data. I'm talking about the actual reanalysis. If you look at the climate, the things are even worse. So what has happened based on the recent years? So that's number one. And the other, of course, is how the compounding events, the frequency of occurrence or compounding occurrence of those surge and heavy precip are reshaping the risk. So these are critical elements that the community needs to understand because there are areas that are high risk that are not known yet or people don't know, and some of our studies show that the more vulnerable communities are located in those compounding and higher risk areas.
Jennifer, did you have a comment or a question?
I do have a question. I'm the social scientist, or at least one of the social scientists on this call. So I have lots of questions, and this I'm learning as I'm listening, which is really exciting for me. I'm wondering if you and if this even makes sense, have thought about how the types of measures or outcomes you're going to use for citizen input or translation and testing, and if that makes sense to think about standardizing across the grant themes, at least some modules for, efficiency's sake, or if those need to be completely independent by theme.
Yeah, so we are supposed to develop metrics that we would use to measure what we're doing. Jim, I don't know if you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, sure. The proposal in phase 2 should include what metrics we're going to use to measure the effectiveness, and I think that kind of underlies some of my thinking about the comments that have been made already about existing tools. I mean, it's not that hard to make a new flood model, but how do you prove that it's good, and what standards of proof should be necessary in order for a lawyer to or a legislature to enact something based on it? FEMA's got pretty well-defined processes for making maps and defining how they should be used and how they should be modified. Everybody else doesn't. So as far as I'm aware, right? So what standards need to be developed in order to I think absence of standards make new things hard to be integrated into decision making in a formal way. So, so standards are key, and I think we should talk about that in our program in the future. And when our proposal needs to have them in order to be competitive. Well, let me make one other point, and that is, here I think the user groups we should focus on are town officials, state officials, engineering company people who are working with towns and states, and not necessarily the broader public. But I'm open to other opinions on that.
Okay, we have a hand up. Is it Malakias? Did I get your name right?
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, in my experience working with operational systems in the National Weather Service, I think our opportunity here is on the integration of local monitoring systems, especially in the coastal and in inland, and integrating that into a mesoscale systems, especially the data simulation schemes. Currently, the National Weather Service, as Phillips mentioned, focus at the national level, and they also run the RTMA regional, but they don't have it at the urban scale. While people have been focusing on forecasting and some of forecasting, the integration of computing the state of the system at the local level just to monitor, it's enough to do a big leap into vulnerabilities. So we cannot track our impacts just because we don't have a real-time local scale data simulation scheme. So that's the first part. In order to improve forecast or nowcasting, I think the integration. Now, we don't have a mission as scientists, we don't have a mission to do operational things. So only demonstration would be good enough for them to integrate that into their operational system. So that's one part. The second comment is about one area that I also feel it's very important for us here. It's modeling the factors that influence the purchase of insurance contracts, because most of the people do not believe yet the risk in which they are standing on. So we have been working with the Zillow data sets now for 3 years to identify what is the factors that, including the cost of their house or the location with respect to the height levels and so on. So I think this is an area that requires scrutiny or more research, social economical factors that influence the decision to get protected, and what type of programs should be kind of incentives for people to really get into flood insurance programs. I've read that in Australia, for instance, they created a community type insurance, so they lower the cost of the premiums just because they do it in a community size scale. So trying to promote this type of financial protections would be something that could be studied or connected to what we are doing.
Okay. I think we have about 1 minute if anybody else wants to chime in quickly, and then we're going to move to our second group of short 5-minute presentations on grant themes. Okay, oh, go ahead.
I thought Luann Cooley's comment was worth just noting briefly. She said, seems like communication has 3 distinct audiences: policymakers, emergency management, and the public, all requiring different levels of information, verification, and urgency. And that's one of the challenges. Absolutely. And I guess I did list it as a challenge. I'm always a little bit confused about whether or not we should try to make things understandable by experts or by everyone. And so we've tried to make we're trying to make 2 layers to our online information, one surface layer that's just like a flood map or something, simple for people to understand. And then the deeper information, and I know NOAA's been doing the same thing, that there's deeper information underneath, but it's a huge challenge. So I agree with that.
Okay, so we'll have a chance to have some additional discussion after this next block and later in the meeting this morning. So we are going to pass it to Brett to talk about nature-based solutions.
Hold on, I'm just trying to bring up my, change my view. Okay, here you go. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Brett Branco. I'm faculty in Earth and Environmental Sciences here at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, and I'm the director of the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, which is a partnership between CUNY, New York City, and the National Park Service. So I'm going to talk about coastal nature-based features. So why it matters. Coastal erosion is causing a loss of property in critical coastal habitat while damaging infrastructure all across the Northeast. Sea level rise and the potential increase in storm frequency and intensity is going to accelerate that erosion in the coming years, in the coming decades, and cause even more infrastructure damage. And the continued coastal development that we're experiencing is going to continue to increase the risk to property, to infrastructure, and to habitat. So what's changed? What we know, people are increasingly interested in nature-based features to help with shoreline erosion problems, because not only can it help reduce the coastal hazard exposure, but it also provides other multiple ecosystem and social, cultural, and economic benefits. And even to the point where there's now starting to be sort of state level legislation and funding available to advance these types of projects. But the suitability and performance of nature-based features really depends on local hydrodynamics and sediment dynamics, among other things, including the ecological conditions and the social economic environment. And we also know that the lack of knowledge on long-term performance is really one of the barriers to creating design guidelines for these types of projects, and definitely a barrier to the permitting process. So it's sort of in this lack of knowledge about long-term performance is inhibiting the wide-scale application of these types of projects in different places. So what are some of the opportunities of this project? One is to start to work on this problem of science-based, nature-based feature design guidelines for not just current conditions, but also for future conditions. Starting to build that evidence base for long-term nature-based feature performance to help inform the permitting process, and creating decision tools for nature-based feature selection based on project goals but also the local conditions. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges in doing this, one of them is just acquiring sufficient hydrodynamic data and performance data at the local project scale that can be generalized to inform general design guidelines. Another challenge is projecting future conditions at local sites that are nested within larger regional dynamics, and I'm thinking about things like sea level rise, but also things about when you do many small projects, they start to have a cumulative impact on the hydrodynamic and sediment conditions. And so doing a project now and then doing a separate project later, there may be some interactions that weren't accounted for in the design of the first project, for example. And another really big challenge is collecting, synthesizing, and visualizing long-term performance data using consistent and locally relevant methods. And there's a lot of people across the country that are thinking about this, but we haven't quite solved that problem. And then some of the challenges in trying to translate this work into action. There's a lot of uncertainty in inherent dynamics in coastal environments, and that is going to require stewardship and adaptive management, and that, of course, brings up regulatory and resource issues, which could make people hesitant to uptake these approaches, even if the regulatory environment is improved. Building collaborative processes to integrate new knowledge on NBF into the regulation and permitting process, I think, is another challenge. We can do all the science we want, but to make sure that it gets that there's a feedback loop into the policy realm. And then providing training and technical support on decision-making tools for local municipalities. And I would extend that to mean not just the government, but also local community groups, which are increasingly engaging with or trying to engage in decision-making about these types of projects. And then, there's a list of questions to the right, which you can read. They're also, I think, the same questions that are in the Miro board. So I won't go over them. That's just to sort of see some discussion. So thank you for listening, and I will now hand it over to Emmanuel to talk about wind hazards.
Thank you. Just to clarify here, the wind hazard aspect that I summarize in this 2 slides is mostly on the power grid. This is the widespread effect of wind hazards along with other weather hazards. They can typically affect frequently events that cause widespread outages, and has been one of the critical issue for the Northeast and other parts of the country too. So as you can see here, this is a report that we generated as part of the regional climate grid resilience study for DOE, but also shows very clearly where some of the high wind gust conditions are going to affect the region. We see significant increase, let's say, on the high wind hazards in the New York area, upstate New York, northwest part of Connecticut, Massachusetts. And actually, if you look at the social vulnerability map, unfortunately, those are the areas where we see the higher vulnerability index conditions. So this is where we expect social vulnerability to intersect significantly and critically with elongated outages, which is a big problem because when an outage occurs, then we have cold snaps or storms that can follow heat waves, which exemplify the impact to society. If we go next, so what changed and why? What we know. So our study actually shows that based on the SSP 8.5, but we can also have examined several different projections. The 60 mile per hour hazard, which is kind of the winds that can critically affect infrastructure, are significantly increasing, as you saw also from the maps here. And that if we look at some of the oversects or cross maps between social vulnerability and outages, you can identify, now here's only for Connecticut, obviously, you can identify significant hotspots within the state that one needs to pay close attention. And guess what? A lot of them are near the coastal communities. So the fragility of the grid, which is within the vegetation that causes a lot of those damages, needs to be addressed. There are solutions here that need to be researched, and this is circuits, expanding the vulnerability of circuits, new technologies like DERs and microgrids. So now what we are looking here for phase 2, as We would like to see climate-induced outage risk assessment. So basically, demonstrating where in which communities we need to do enhance their resilience to those wind hazards, and then of course pilot new technologies that can provide solutions down to the community level, whether that's local microgrid solutions or targeting some grid enhancement technologies. Next. So what are the challenges here? Number one, uncertainty. Everything we do here is driven by models that are learning based on long data. So what's the type of the impact? Wind hazard alone is not the only driver. So how the hazard interacts with other conditions, right? Combination of parameters like temperature. And of course, uncertainty in the model predictions that needs to be accounted for. Number two is, how do we really measure resilience improvements? That's a big problem that communities are always asked when they're investing millions of dollars, right? And looking for solutions. What's the reference definition? What's the non-standardized metrics that we need to incorporate? The non-standardized metrics add equity, social condition or social equity, and also vulnerability. And last, we are dealing with low probability, high impact events. How are those characterized in the impact models that we're using? Now, grid conditions. This is something that is evolving. So when we are doing those assessments, we need to look at how the infrastructure is aged, how the community is engaged, what are the grid enhancement plans that states and communities and utilities are taking, approval delays, all of those, the time component, right? So let's go next. And so some actionable items related to the challenges is creating a resilience roadmap, working with the regulators, working with the ratepayers, working with the utilities that are investing on those grid enhancement technologies, and demonstrating cost benefit. Benefit doesn't have to be always in the dollar amount. Circuit level dashboard. We need to demonstrate to the people, to communities, where those hazards are, down to the community level, down to the road level and circuit level. Present the risk coming from outages over different periods of time, and finally demonstrating how long it takes to restore power. I'll go fast. Community microgrids. That's something that we all discuss about. We need to create local solutions, especially during outage events, and how those microgrids will provide resilience to the communities. And last, we want forecasting. That's one more. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We need forecasting tools eventually. We need to actually inform people way ahead of time when those damages and hazards will happen, so they can operate optimally those microgrids or bring crews and restore accordingly. So yes. So these are some of the questions that I put here for consideration. Can we integrate probabilities in these wind threats? Can we add measurements that to advance some of our predictive capabilities? And that's very important. And then what pilot projects? Because we cannot just jump ahead without understanding how this affects and how communities and how much it costs and who benefits. Very important. So that's all for me, and I can pass to next speaker.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Manos. And my name is Yaprak Onat, and I'm part of the Circa team, and I'm going to talk about the final research team, which is the heat risk. Why it matters in Northeast perspective, because we know already have confidence that there's going to be warming, and with the urbanization, there are different demographic shifts. So there's an increased heat-related issue is happening, and that is enhancing the problems on health that in these vulnerable communities, from seniors to youth to more about immune compromised communities. And we also have a group that is working outside, that these increased heat conditions severely lead into heat strokes or other related problems from like vector-borne diseases too. So as like the Northeast region, we are prepared for the cold, but we are not so much prepared for the increased heat risk. And what we know about the heat exposure is that it can vary from block to block in a city, because there's been like historically planning structures that made this kind of a disparity, or buildings or vegetation. Some socioeconomic factors also lead into this uneven equity problems in the small towns. And we have available heat indices in different regions, but they generally use like land surface temperature, which doesn't necessarily reflect what people are feeling on the street level. As for our R2I2 opportunity, like an outcome, what we want to have is like we want to identify decisions and places where we are going to put like cooling areas or green places, how we are going to design that and then protect the people who are the most vulnerable in these like working conditions or health conditions, and understand like how their exposure in the street level with the data that's being provided to them for temperature, relative humidity, and the wind sensors in that specific build and environment and an activity they're going through in their day-to-day life, and translate these decision-making information into more than just like the heat indices that's obtained from satellite information, but really targeting like what people are feeling and what people are doing, and then prepare adaptation options according to that. Some of the challenges that we have, like what we have available is that we can deploy sensors, we can measure like street level air temperature, humidity, and wind, but like it needs to be in the right metrics that what people are feeling, and it needs to consider like what the day-to-day life, like what they're feeling too. And when we are putting these sensors, why we are putting it there, what kind of a contributions in that microclimate that is really impacted that like the heat index, or like what people feel in that street level too. And we need to also create like a more shareable methods, actionable items, so that people can take this approach from one town to another time, even though it's like an urban or a rural area, so that it can have a certain like quality analysis and control metrics, and also uncertainty is being clearly explained. What we want to do is like translate these like problems into actionable opportunities, like some of the challenges that we are having in that. When you're turning into maps into decisions, where we are going to interfere, what kind of intervention are going to do, how we are going to prioritize that area fairly. And that is very important to bring like the adaptable solutions quickly in that region, and quantify what works. Yes, it is easy to say that let's add like more trees, let's do more trees, but is that really going to cool it? Or there are different approaches needs to be adapted based on like where you are in the block. It's not always realistic to do just like open this build, turn this building into cooling shelter or not. We need to consider all kinds of design challenges that they are having, and accessibility of the people in that area too, and make it implementable. Of course, like the low burden workflows that we need to create to the municipality staff, because whatever that we are designing, we want it to be used from town to town. So with the limited resources that the municipalities have, that we want to make it more actionable and have clear metrics to identify what's the success of our issue in these heat risk adaptation too. And with that, we are ending all our 3 teams, and then we can open the up to the questions now. You can use chat, raise your hand, or write it on the Miro board. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes. If anybody has any comments, thoughts about any of these research themes. And I think I might take the prerogative to kick it off. And my question is for Brett. And I'm specifically thinking about, are we mostly defining the hazard as erosion risk? Or what do we have to say about coastal nature-based features that would address flood risk? You know, what is kind of the approach that can be used to address flooding? Are there scale challenges? What are some of the issues there?
Yeah, no, great question, John. And just for the sake of brevity, was kind of kept it, fairly fairly vague on that. But I think both, but also to address loss of coastal habitat, right? That's a big motivation in New York City, for example, in trying to adopt these approaches. So, it's all of the above, I think. And actually it can even add one more, and that's possibly like improving waterfront access, right? So I think all of these are important. I do think that people, especially like community members, have a misconception sometimes about what kinds of hazards a nature-based feature is actually trying to address. I think there's sometimes a misconception that that a certain type of project is going to afford some flood risk reduction, when it's really not. So yeah, it's all of those. And we should be thinking about all of those as we in the work group that we form around this. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's definitely one that I'd like to be a part of that working group, because I just have a lot of thoughts about it. And but other questions, thoughts? I think Sarah had a comment. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Sure. Yes. Hi. I just wanted to add in, because of course heat is one of the things that is extremely obvious and we've been working on for a while, and we have to deal with that, of course. But I just want to highlight, in relation to the flooding, to the wind, to the other things that we've been talking about, that looking at winter adaptation issues and winter hazards in terms of, it's easier to think a little bit of winter warming doesn't do so much damage, but we know that those small shifts in temperature can result, instead of a snowstorm, in ice storms and in damage to infrastructure and other kinds of issues that, particularly as we become more reliant on renewable energy, on electrification, and on internet and access to how we're communicating with people with networks, that particularly in the Northeast, looking at these winter condition shifts that are related to the summer heat, right? It's still a warming issue. This has been very, very little addressed. And in fact, with our graduate student project last year, we found that there was pretty much just Chicago had put it into their climate planning, but almost nobody else has looked at it systematically. And the Northeast is a critical place for adding this. And again, I feel that it's synergistic with the other themes that were presented.
Other thoughts? Jim?
Yeah, I have a comment. I mean, we've heard quite a lot, of about approaches and problems, and what I think we need to focus our discussion on, perhaps now and at least at the end of the meeting, is what are the sort of fundamental science obstacles that we can address? Because if you're thinking about a competitive proposal at the end of this process, it's got to have some characteristics that make it competitive. One is it's got to review well by NSF reviewers, right? And so for that, I think in addition to identifying the problems and the needs and approaches, we need to say, how do we improve it? Or what are the obstacles to making these things more impactful? And then another alternative really is there a technology development that would move the usefulness of this knowledge more effective? So if anybody wants to comment on that from the point of view of flooding or heat risk or any other issue, it would be good.
And it looks like there's a couple of comments in the chat if anybody wants to elaborate. And also Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Jim, if you could talk a little bit more about the type of technology. Like, are you thinking about technology for various stakeholder groups, including citizens, maybe, or the business community, or who we want to react to this type of prediction? Or is there another kind of technology that you're thinking about?
You're muted, Jim.
Like you could think of technology as being building new gadgets or instruments, or using existing data in a new way. So technology to integrate local observations with regional models, as Mal suggested. There are people working on these using AI and machine learning, and that and developing something that's like implemented easier. That's a technology development thing. And I think NSF, especially the TIP program, would be supportive of that kind of project. But it could also be a better instrument for measuring rainfall. I mean, there's radar methods have been around for a long time, and tipping buckets have been around for a long time, but we don't have a really very good measurement system for the spatial structure and temporal variability of precip. I mean, those are just examples, but you know, that's kind of what I'm thinking of. We could advance technology as part of this program, or we could make the implementation of existing models more rapid, effective, or we could develop standards. I mean, these are these are limitations that exist and handicap resilience and adaptation implementation.
I mean, Jim, when it comes to flooding, the National Weather Service has very advanced tools for medium to long range. And we've seen both severe weather predictions coming out and I think the extent of the lead time has been quite magnificent in terms of the predictions now in our days. I think where the problem is, how do you interpret the hazard into localized impact? And that's where the I guess your scalability, your granularity is focused. And I think it's a challenge, because when you take a widespread precipitation or heavy precipitation event and you try to decide who is going to be impacted the most, obviously that's when things get really difficult, right? My understanding is in the community right now, and as we evolve into a future proposal, there has been so much effort in the private sector too on AI solutions that would quickly identify or learn from past patterns and provide localized guidance and incidence control and incidence information. So I don't think I think we need to be part of that. I think we need to be cognizant of that and include that into our future plans. A lot of what we do is AI based anyway. So and that's a path forward, but how do we incorporate detailed new data to be ahead of the game, actually, to provide additional information to what is done out in the innovation community, but also in the at the National Weather Service? It will be a critical step. So additional data and at the granular level would bring that new training or enhanced training that will provide more localized or local relevant information to the public. At least that's my take on this.
In terms of heat waves, let me comment. I was involved in an international project on heat health. And there are some fundamental barriers that, as Jim mentioned, one of them is that we don't have actually morbidity statistics. We have only mortality statistics. And that's because, and so this is not this is a key missing data, because in order to get to the statistics of mortality, we should have kind of a way to measure the risk of mortality by measuring morbidity. So how the people feel and how the heat body index is varying. And now this is associated again with sensors like indoor temperature, because that's more important than the outside temperature. There are already some studies like in Baltimore and Chicago that they try to do estimations by looking at the infrared emissions of buildings, but there is not an easy relationship. We need an AI to connect indoor temperature with what they see outside. So this scientific connection is also fundamental. So there are two parts there.
Okay, I'm going to jump in the interest of time. And I think any of these topics could be a pretty rich discussion over the course of, several hours. One of the things we forgot to mention was we have the option of, if folks are interested in having a follow-up discussion on a particular research theme, we can have a member of the team organize a meeting that would just focus on flood data, for instance, and go deeper on that theme and discuss more. So if you're interested in participating in a more in-depth discussion on any of these research themes, you could just indicate that, put it in the chat, put it in the Miro board, just email one of us, however you'd like to communicate. But because we'll sort of evaluate that after this meeting and make a decision about whether we're going to organize some follow-up discussions that will help to kind of set up the working group process that Jim mentioned later in the grant. So we're going to switch gears, and another one of the themes that was in the proposal had to do with policy and how we integrate all of these different technologies and innovations into policy. And so Joe is going to lead us on a discussion on that.
So hi, everyone. I'm Joe McDougall. I was like this. I'm from the law school, and I'm here to help. So it's a great thing to be in legal academia and to be tied into these groups. It's been something we've done at Circa that's been really impactful, and I'm really excited for this grant. So I have a couple of slides, and then Luann Cooley, both of Circa, as well as helping out the law school, and Linda Shai of Cornell AAP are going to join us in a bit of a policy discussion. So let me share up. And hopefully you're seeing the screen. Yes. Good.
Yep.
So my primary message is, and I think that this is something that's just been true being in, for now many years in part of these technical discussions, and you could really hear it even particularly from Kim's opening in the first panel. Everyone's a policy person. You may think you're not, but you're absolutely a policy person. And even trying from everything to getting the data that people need to work on the models to adoption, it's really important to emphasize this is a very broad definition of, I think, who can participate in the policy effort. The other themes I've got, this grant is a really great opportunity to bring, research and action closer together on a regional scale. That's not done a lot. And I think that if both in this early cycle, as we talk about scoping, and hopefully in a second cycle, it's a really unique opportunity to sort of leverage collective thinking into implementation. Implementation's a wicked problem, right? There's no one answer. We've got legislation, local regulation, policy, community adoption with needs and EJ concerns. And importantly, it needs a different kind of thinking, right? Any solution we work toward or try to champion needs to be adaptive to technical developments, right? These topics you heard in the first two panels are alive. They're working. There's new technology. There are new tools. And we've had at least a little experience with trying to work in regulations that recognize that, as opposed to treating things as static administrative activities. And I think one of the things we really want to focus on is the opportunities and impediments to how we're going to be looking at policy. So the ultimate goal, and as I typed this slide out, I'm like, that sounds like it's in stone, ultimate goal. But at least this is what we wrote in the grant, would be to end in a useful translational implementation matrix. What do I mean by that? Let's assume we took nature-based solutions as one example, or we could take, heat zoning or anything else that we look at in this area. This path to solution throughout each state and the path toward implementation in each state in the Northeast and the region is different. And it would be a great way for us to talk about what it would mean for categories of technical solutions, and then work out the pathways for what's the best way to bring those into effective policy in the different states. Rhode Island, as an example, has on coastal areas some very centralized decision making. Connecticut, without our county government, is a little bit of a free-for-all, depending on how we're doing it. New York can be, I always say New York is like Westeros, as to how we try and make our way into the policy groups. So getting an understanding of that, both in the direct legislative and regulatory ways, but also in the soft power way, community adoption, communication, would be a great way for us to start in this first phase, but would be a terrific outcome. And, as we go forward, I'm really going to be interested to get people's thoughts as to whether or not that's the right thing to shoot at. So I wanted to talk through an example of, for instance, of a little bit of what we have in mind. I think it's a little easier to focus on. This is something we did in Circa. Circa, a lot of the topics we talked about, we worked to get a change at state legislation, Public Act 1882. And in the grabbing the pen in the middle is our Circa fearless leader, Jim O'Donnell, standing behind the governor. This was an act that redefined how we were thinking about sea level rise. And part of it's to talk about the act, but I really want to talk about the process as something I've got in mind for what we can do together. So if you think about getting legislators to act and the type of data that they need, two things were interesting at that time. One, getting increased coastal flooding was obvious to people, right? They could see it, it's tractable. But for years, and I was a petty politician for many, many years, I was a zoning chair for a lot of that time, we'd been getting meetings and people coming to our boards talking about the problems of inundation, slow level inundation in areas where really our problem that's obvious to almost all of you on the panel, but wasn't so obvious to some of those groups, was really flooding from storm-based flooding and the pathways for resilience. And that policy shift was perhaps not moving as quickly as some of the decision maker local roles. Jim was tasked by taking the national scenarios and trying to come to a target for communities. We talked a lot, and this was mentioned, and I can't remember whether it was Philip earlier in the presentations. We're trying to figure out how to talk to communities, and we thought about giving them different scales and different pieces. And what the message came back from surveying, just direct meeting, give us a number, we'll plan to a number. And Jim can tell this part of the story better, but realistically, he looked at the Connecticut impact of sea level rise, and this is his chart that I've lifted, and said, well, we may have varying impacts farther out, but we know that 50 centimeters by 2050 is at least a reasonable target for that time, and recognize that it will move. So that's the beginning of the scientific part. What happened next is this is a chart that actually Jim presented in one of my climate law classes, and to a bunch of law students, this went off like a bomb. But Jim was really quite, he said, well, everyone knows this, and I assured him everyone did not. This is the return rate for flooding at 10-year and 100-year levels. And what you can see by it is it separates the western and eastern Long Island Sound. And up to this point in time, in policy circles, sea level rise had been viewed as sort of one thing. And the importance of it, was on an insurance basis. We have a big insurance folks at our school. All the, real estate value located in Fairfield County, which is far more developed than the area north. Well, this started to show, and this became important when we talked to legislators and communicating it, that look, for everything from New Haven toward Rhode Island, the worst storm you can remember in the last 10 years is now going to be showing up something like every year and a half. But the worst storm that you can remember in Greenwich is going to be coming about every 2.5 years. And that was just all bad all over the place, as opposed to focusing on it as a single thing. This also led to something that was very persuasive. We surveyed, and this graph is out of date, but is what we used at the time. We surveyed towns to say what have they done to their base flood elevation, the number that they need that the towns can control in Connecticut to indicate the base flood level in flood zones that they permit. And what we saw was this chart above that said, hey, look, the people from New Haven onward are experiencing this in real time. They're already looking at it. Organically, without any planning or circa or state law, we could see that they were responding just on their own, where the grouping from New Haven down to Westport really weren't responding in the same way. And this type of thing was exceptionally persuasive to legislators for enactment. We could say this isn't just a theory, this is a response that we're seeing both for what they say, but what they've experienced. This led us to the act itself. So the act that came in consultation with Circa and the law school and the agency that was put forward and championed by the governor was about declaring first that thing that the communities want, 50 centimeters by 2050. Give us a number. Here's our number that we've got. Our second thing was that say that this would be updated at least every 10 years. And the path to update, and this was, I can say, very much driven by the law school, was to say this could be updated as a matter of administrative efficiency. The DEP can issue a new update based on research that comes out of the university. That was a big deal. It means that the legislation was adaptive. Towns had to respond to it. We have a plan of conservation development. Most zoning has something similar, but it had to take into account the updated sea level rise projections, and as well as did the state plan POCD as well. And we also went into the technical definitions of what it means to implement this, something that developers and the community could go through. The reason I wanted to bring that up is it showed each of them sound quick in the telling, but the development process included a lot of conversation back and forth from what we were finding on the technical and scientific end, the community leaders for what they needed, and how we would get adoption. So that was state level. We also did some other items. We started to develop tools to help indicate what the contours of resilience were. We used this extensively for some years to try and work with towns. We found that if we used their actual maps, people would point to their house, so in a town. So we created sort of neutral maps that showed the existence of problems in a hypothetical fashion. And that was a really good educational tool. And this will go a little bit toward what Luann will be talking about next. Beyond just the work at the state level, we also started to turn out policy adoption tools. A lot of towns want to do things, but they're strapped for expertise. They also need the way to explain the justification for a change that at some level is going to impact, property owners and taxpayers. And we started to developing, these are just some of the first white papers that we came up, and towns, some of these were extremely effective and were enacted up and down the coast in Connecticut. So a combination of both the straightforward legislative power of indicating opportunities, as well as helping towns to enact. So I think that, good, my share's gone. That type of sort of combined thinking about the problem, technical integration, time with communities, trying to identify the differences in the region, and then looking at where the changes can go, as a for instance, I think is a real opportunity across the discussions we had in the first two panels. And it's something that really, now you see why I started with everyone's a policy person. It needs a lot of effort, right? We need to talk to all of you in order to shape the policy. It can't just be, you know, sitting in a law school office typing out what might be a good idea. That's not the way this works, particularly on the subtleties of modeling, adaptation, even the point that Manos brought up about the National Weather Service, because you get those types of conversations. Why should we do this? What about the federal guidance? We need to have that justification with authority, but also with a way that we can understand and communicate it directly to towns. And I'd like to turn it over to Luann because I talked mostly about state implementation, but let's talk a little bit about the community pieces.
Hi, thanks very much, Joe. I'm Luann Cooley, and I'm a legal policy fellow at Circa. And I was asked mostly to talk about policy regarding extreme heat and how we've addressed that at Circa so far. But I'm going to expand that a bit because I think first we need to really consider that for this area and others too within climate adaptation and resilience, we need to think about at what level is policy necessary, effective, and legally authorized. And from the legal perspective, really starting from that as a baseline when you're trying to develop policy really helps guide what you can't do and what needs to happen. So we're a regional group and we're mostly going to be focused at the state and local levels, but we also do have to acknowledge that there's a federal aspect to some of these policies as well, especially with regard to heat in some places and how we'll interact with any state, how that interacts with any state or local policy initiatives. And also when we're using the word local with this group, we're really talking local could mean New York City, or it could mean Union, Connecticut, which has 1,000 residents. So scale is incredibly important, and recognizing that a scale of policy scale that works at New York City or at Boston is really not necessarily going to be effective for, you know, more rural places in New England as well. So that needs to be a consideration as well. So I'm going to use the word local, but interpret that as it needs to be interpreted for the particular aspect. So when I think about heat and heat policies, really heat policy has fallen into a few different bins. There are probably more. First, there's been a lot of discussion about protection for workers who are dealing with extreme heat. Then it's also been thought about as a public health problem for those vulnerable residents that may lack cooling. Also as a land use policy or nature-based and design solutions that can ameliorate extreme heat. And then finally, heat policy as a threat to infrastructure. And this is something we haven't really talked about, but is going to be an increasing issue that's going to come up. Things like diminishing public water supplies, stress on electric grids, damages to roads or bridges. So mostly I'm going to talk about the first two because there's been quite a bit of work on that, or at least I should say discussion. As far as worker protections go, this is really where that federal level kind of kicks in when we think about protections for worker falls under OSHA. And one of the kind of bright spots of this is that there really is a current rulemaking underway to increase protections for workers, both indoor and out, in places where heat exceeds a heat index of 80 degrees. And so far, that's moving forward. There hasn't been any pushback on that so far. The rulemaking began, I believe, in 2024, and it's moving forward. The policies you can find online are pretty straightforward and provide a lot of protections for workers that are currently not protected. This is an issue that's gotten quite a bit of press as people, especially in the South, have died. I think over 800 people have died in work heat related incidents in the last couple of decades, and that's probably likely to increase. It's not been such an issue we've seen in the Northeast, but it will become so. So as far as at the state level, so far, California is the only state I think that's actually legislated and passed worker protections regarding heat. Although the good news in the Northeast, at least, is that at the state level, most states have been discussing this. In Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York, bills have been introduced to add additional protections for workers. They've gotten quite a bit of discussion. They've been very well formatted, and they've gone nowhere. They haven't been passed. And I suspect that's largely because people are waiting to see what's going to happen at the federal level. And if the federal protections are adequate, there probably won't be a need for state level protections, but we'll see. On the local level, both Boston and New York have looked at protections for workers. They have released guidance, and in some cases, some local ordinances to increase worker protections. Now, as far as issues for public health, this is an area where we at Circa have actually done some work. As Yaprak was talking about earlier, we have partnered with public health departments in the town of Norwalk to look at issues of extreme heat, starting with the scientific data collection with heat sensors, where is the heat a problem, and thinking about what kinds of local policy can be used to address that. Whether we're talking about where can you put a cooling center? Do you need to change your land use regulations to allow for that? Can you add additional design standards into your land use regulations to encourage and protect street trees, to add green space, to add green roofs, incentivizing those kinds of things. And that's been well received, but the issue with using vegetation as your heat ameliorating impact is that you can plant trees today that won't have much of an impact for 20 to 30 years. So thinking about what kinds of things can be done for helping those vulnerable residents that may lack cooling, which in the Northeast can be a big problem because older homes and buildings may generally lack AC. They've been designed generally to conserve heat, not to add for airflow or things like that. Incentive programs at the state level through state agencies or quasi-state agencies. In Connecticut, we have the Green Bank, which helps run the Energize CT program, which encourages people to add in heat pumps, add in insulation, which may have a positive impact on both heat conservation and cooling. These are policies that can be fairly easily adopted as long as there is the capacity for them and the funding. So there are things that can be done, that have been done with regards to heat, and hopefully we will see more on that as well. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Luann. We'll now go to Linda Shai from Cornell. Linda is aside from being a professor at the AAP school, is also the director of the Masters in Regional Planning program. She's written some of my favorite pieces that I assign, including one about helping to finance resilience, and has spoken at the law school a couple of times and will again on Earth Day, which you'll all shamelessly get an invitation for later. Linda, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you all. A couple years ago, I was a PI for planning grant to create the Northeast Climate Adaptation Partnership under NOAA, and then we developed the full proposal. So I really fully appreciate the challenges of figuring out across a really large and diverse interdisciplinary team, how do you figure out what are the manageable priority issue areas to focus on for a winning project. And so I'll just focus on some of my remarks here. I heard a little bit of the first panel, and I would say that I don't know. I think it's an important question to think about what parts of the science we don't know that would really change policy. For instance, we've known a really long time that it's important to conserve coastal environments for habitat biodiversity as well as for coastal flood resilience. Like, it's not new that dunes or seagrass is good for people and good for nature. We've known for a long time that before it was called nature-based solutions, it was called green infrastructure. Before that, it was low impact development. Before that, it was sustainability. You could go back to Ian McHarg with design for, with nature, and before that to Patrick Geddes and thinking about watershed scale regional planning and IWRM. So, and then you could look at heat. We've all known that communities that are low income, that have not much space, the lots are, the land costs are very high. So we're going to need to do small lots and narrow streets that have no space for street trees and no green plantings. Hedonic modeling shows that those neighborhoods are not as valuable. Amenity-rich neighborhoods tend to be priced higher in property values because people value that kind of green space. So we know all of that. And I think to some extent, the science is needed to answer very important questions like, we want nature-based solutions, but let's not confound water quality improvements with real 100-year storm benefits. How much wetland or sand dune are you going to need to achieve measurable impacts in order to mitigate from the real 100-year, 500-year flooding that people actually expect to see? Like, I think there are real, how many trees do you need to plant of what species to get what kinds of air quality and temperature gains over what period of time. But having answered those questions, would we expect policy to change, given that in the past they have not necessarily always been responsive to existing science and existing social imperatives for doing this kind of work? And why don't policymakers act on this kind of good science? Are they just dumb, or are they not knowing it, or are they bad people? Like, I think it's none of those things. There are real policy constraints that shape why local and state governments behave the way they do. And so I think the real crux here is, what new knowledge can the science, natural science and social science really generate that might move the policy ticket a little bit? So one part, I think, is to really be cognizant that a lot of the nature-based solutions that are being our interest now and are being discussed in this group are very land extensive. And so from a land use policy perspective in a local government context, anything that takes up a lot of land is going to cost a lot. So for instance, right now for my class, we're working in Barre, Vermont, which is one of the worst repetitively flooded communities in the country. That county has received the second highest number of federal disaster declarations in the country. So they had FEMA money to do buyouts, but they rejected most of the local applications, the household applications for buyouts, because they could not afford to turn this into forever green sites, which is FEMA policy, and then lose long-term the property taxes. A couple years ago, UPenn did an incredible urban design studio showing what you could do with vacant lots, how you could move the industries, how you could turn that river corridor into open space, but they have no staff capacity to actually do any of that work, and poor relations with the surrounding town of Barre that doesn't necessarily want to absorb the population or the industries from the city of Barre. So I think this really goes to underscore that even if we were able to show the imperative and the benefits of some of these nature-based or other infrastructural solutions, cities may not be able to implement them due to lack of capacity or to the current structural reliance on property tax. So there needs to be real conversations on the governance of these kinds of transitions to different technological land use strategies that are really difficult to talk about. I think they are very difficult conversations around property taxes, shared services, local government, governance reform, mergers. In Vermont, they're talking about creating counties for the first time. So all of these things need to be explored. And I think the question is, does the science change, or the science that needs to change, the science that needs to produce, will that change given the policy question that needs to be answered? Are there opportunities to shape that in the scale or the geographic scale to show the kind of scales at which different things are effective to reach certain policy tipping points? Or is it, so to show the imperative of changing policy, or to show the scale across municipalities and how across a geographic reach we might achieve different kinds of policy changes? I think those are super important. And then one last point, I think maybe, Joe, you're telling me my time is up or something.
No, I hit the wrong button.
Oh, okay. Okay. The other part I think is interesting to think about is that we usually now talk about nature-based solutions in the context of nature helping us mitigate disasters and in effect replacing the gray infrastructure with now a green piece of infrastructure. But functionally, for all intents and purposes, it's the same thing. And to kind of question that a little bit, like for instance, I just was at the Multiplied Displacements Conference that Jesse Keenan hosted at Tulane University, and I met Associate Dean from University of Alberta, and he works a lot with indigenous communities like the Inupiaq in Alaska, and they commented on his way of talking about nature-based solutions and said, if there's a wildfire, you guys only want to put it out if it's near human settlements and might damage property. But if there's a wildfire that's going to kill all of the animals and trees in another part, but not hurt people, you care not at all about what happens in that particular stretch. So as we think about like putting animals, plants, bioecological systems on the front line so that they can be the first to be destroyed and absorb all this shock again and again, like physically, how long does it take those systems to recover if they're repeatedly, increasingly being hit by something? But also, like, is this the relationship that we have? That's one part of it, right? So what is a commitment to ecological conservation? And what is the expectation that we're putting things in place for them to be destroyed and to weather the most impacts? Another part of that is to think about historically, people who have actually sustained nature-based solutions, so-called traditional ecological knowledge, which is probably how most of humanity lived for Earth's history, they did not think of this as being nature-based solutions or green infrastructure. This kind of the use of nature is really inherently tied into human survival, food systems, cultural systems. So if you look at UNESCO World Heritage sites like the Ifugao rice terraces or the Bali terraces in Philippines and Indonesia, respectively, that is part of a food system, but is also a way of how people managed water and flooding and landslides and food subsistence in flood-prone mountainside areas. If you look at basically any indigenous community, how they live, it is not to say we're using nature. I think Vanessa Watson, no, sorry, not Vanessa Watson, what is her name? Julia Watson's Low Tech book, where she studies indigenous technologies from around the world, shows rather than having protect, accommodate, retreat as totally separate systems, what typifies indigenous systems is that they are simultaneously accommodate, protect, and retreat, all three together. And so if we think about rather than either conservation on the one hand and then a bunch of development on the other hand, how can we structure nature-based solutions to be new forms of ecological systems that learn from that past, that use food systems If people care about the food that they eat, if they care about this kind of protection, and that nature doesn't just have value as a kind of value add to property and recreation. If we have other types of relationships, we may also be more invested in caring for that system which is we need to have happen in these different places. So I'll just leave it at that and open up for any questions and comments.
Thank you. We have, Nicole tells me we've got 5 or 6 minutes for questions. Who have we got? Otherwise, I'll shamelessly do it myself. Sec.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
Can you see me? Can you see me? Yeah.
Yeah, go
So
ahead, Manos.
my video is not working for some reason, but anyway, so it seems dark. So one point I wanted to make, and it's very interesting. I mean, the state decided on the how sea level rise based on projections and of course extensive analysis. And that affects coastal communities, and particularly areas where we have argued extensively that they are compounding. Sea level rise may compound with heavy precipitation events. The entire region, though, is not just sea level rise. The entire region will be affected by the intensification of precipitation. And that has received very limited attention, I think. And I mentioned that before, and I'll mention it again. All the designs, the thousands, tens of thousands of culverts, infrastructure, everything, name it, is done based on the 30, 40 years NOAA Atlas. The IDFs that are coming from long record data that, in my opinion, and we've shown that over and over, it's outdated. Climate change didn't start today. It started 30 years ago. And if you look at studies, IDFs are vastly different, not everywhere. And that's the important thing, are vastly different in some areas. Some areas actually, it's helping. It's actually reducing the risk. Some other areas, though, we see significant impact. And I think the Northeast will see some IDFs that need to be taken seriously into consideration changes. That non-stationarity in the risk needs to be accounted in the discussions with the communities and how we are reevaluating the risk of infrastructure. We're not going to go and redesign every single culvert. I leave it that to the consultants, but we're gonna talk to the communities and say this is where we see the changes, and that's how we believe this would potentially affect your infrastructure, because different infrastructure designs are based on different return periods. Not every structure is designed according to the same return period. Culverts are 5 years, others are with different. I mean, bridges have different, like dams, different. So we need to look at those return periods and see how IDF changes or changes in the precipitation intensity that went into the design 30 years ago, 20 years ago, have been need to be rethought and reevaluated. That's critical, in my opinion. And as important the sea level rise is for the coastal communities, think about now the vast areas that cover the entire conus.
I think just briefly before we get to Jen's question, that's very much, I think, Linda, in line with what you were saying about the siloing of how we think about this. But, ages ago, Jim and I were at a zoning enforcement, I love this story, zoning enforcement officers meeting, and it was after Irene and Sandy. And I asked the throwaway question of, what are you seeing that's different? And it was all the coastal ZEOs that put up a hand and said, our roads are failing too fast. Right? Inundation this way. And it wasn't like right afterward. It had now taken over time. If you know anything about road financing on a municipal basis, it's very straight line, spreadsheety. And that was becoming just one of the basic problems where the expectations were different. Jen, why don't you ask the question, then we can toss to our whole panel, see if we have answers on this or both.
Yeah. And it's a bit of a question and more of an observation. First of all, again, like there's just so much here. And one thing that you said, Linda, that really struck with me as someone who is a policy person, but more in a social science way, is when you were talking about the limitations of policymakers and the reasons that there's limitations, right? There's limitations in the process, but I do think there's also limitations in knowing and access to information, because as we're thinking about this, and there seems to be a lot of commonality in the challenges among the different themes, but there's also some differences. And this is just, it's so technical in the policy making. So how do we, I'm still thinking of sort of like the unifying, how do we come up with a potential product that does make the knowing easier through access to briefs or experts, or some of that might be another product that, and how do we use technology to do that, whether it's to the policymakers or their staffs, or to community organizations trying to figure out which solution they want their policymakers to pursue. Can we come up with a way to unify this information and make it easily accessible and usable?
Linda or Luann?
I can tell you how we structured it in our proposal, which ended up being well ranked, but was not funded because of things in real life in Congress this past year. One thing that we felt was really important was that each of the states in New England and New York are doing really innovative work. Like Vermont just adopted a couple years ago the Flood Safety Act, which is the first in the country to require people to leave land aside for for river corridors. So designating an area for rivers to allow for fluvial change in the future, and then to not build in those areas and begin to slowly, in some ways. I think the policy has not yet thought about like retreat, but certainly not adding new development to river corridor areas. Each state has all these different innovations, and there's not really a great venue for cross-state learning. And so there needs to be a venue for the state policymakers, the staffers, and others to learn from each other and to replicate to some extent the policies, which would certainly make it easier for the consultants, the developers, the builders to have a consistent and economies of scale in construction standards that not every tiny little state. One thing we learned was that entire region of New England would fit inside the state of New Mexico, but we have many different states and different policies. Another is to figure out like who are the people with capacity, and to create coalition networks and hubs and spokes across them so that there is a mechanism for dissemination of change. So we had proposed creating a leadership academy that would bring people who are themselves leaders in networked organizations, regional, or sometimes they are part of a nonprofit that's a network. And so if you bring them together to figure out how to work with others on some of these challenges, they will be then sharing it and disseminating across their own networks. So I think that scaling up from a case study, we tend to have in these projects, you say it's such a large region, let's pick a few communities that we work with and they become your case study pilot places. But then after a project is over, that project tends to then, the knowledge doesn't go beyond it. So how do you figure out your scalability and impact approach, I think is really important. So that's why I suggested finding out other kinds of institutions that might be your key partners for them to take on the work from the very beginning.
And Luann, any comments on that as we're at time and we need to wrap this panel?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that I completely agree with that. And I think the challenge is to develop a suite of tools that are able to be used and tailored to the particular context and scale of the issues and the problems that you're addressing. And that may not necessarily be possible for all of these particular issues that we've talked about. But having that understanding that context is incredibly important, as we're finding with the vulnerability assessments when they close in on scale, and finding that trying to figure out where that precipitation event is going to have a really dramatic and traumatic effect, how challenging that is. And the tools for both at the science level, figuring out where those things are happening, and on the policy level, figuring out how do you protect and add adaptation are equally challenging.
Yeah,
Thank
Joe,
you.
I know we're at time. Can I give like one quick example of, so most of my work is in firearm injury prevention, which is very far from where you all are, but it has some similarities is that it is not one type of injury. It is a series, it is a variety of injuries that all have a variety of causes and happen in a variety of different environments. And happen disproportionately to a variety of communities. So I think that there's some commonality in the type of the problem. Joe and I have talked about the commonality of wicked problems with firearm injury and climate before. One thing that we've done, and it wouldn't be a product for all of the issues, but it could be a potential idea or solution to just bat around, is we built an information clearinghouse where people can go and they can sort by type of injury, they can sort by population, they can sort by type of source, whether they want something that's a policy brief or they want an academic article or they want some more media thing. But something like that as a product and sort of a product that kind of keeps this regional group together might be attractive to NSF. That's it.
Thank you. Well, I think we need to leave it there, but thank you all very much. And I'll turn it back over to Nicole and Jim. Thank you. And John.
Thanks, Joe. I think we have, let's see. I mean, I think we're at the point now where we just want to open it up for any discussion about pretty much anything we've heard this morning. Questions about the overall schedule, anything like that. If folks have comments or questions. And Jim is standing by as the lead PI to answer them.
Thank you.
Yes, Ran.
Hear me? Okay, here we go. I have a quick question for Jim. I was wondering, have we thought about what kind of time scale we're developing in terms of actually the science question and also the adaptation strategies that we're trying to aiming at? Are we trying to develop some kind of short-term workflow response plan that can be implemented across New England region, or are we more aiming toward helping with infrastructure planning? In that case, we're looking at things like decadal prediction of extreme weather events, probabilities, and things like that.
So both. I mean, I think what we're looking for is problems which need to be addressed by more geosciences that are significant, tractable, and yeah, I guess that's it. So it could be response to events, forecasting events, so these would be short scale things, but also we need to understand how to better build for the future. So and Manos kind of hit on this, I think, and I think it's clearly important, is what precipitation levels should be being used by towns in northern Maine and southern New Jersey in 2050, right? And what measurements do we need? What improvements to science, to projections do we need in order to inform that? Because if we tell everybody to build stuff that's too big, then we're not doing something else that's important. And if we build them too small, then we're putting people at risk. And I think the National Climate Assessment and even the progress on Atlas 15 maybe too coarse.
Okay.
Does that
Yeah,
help?
so Yeah, that does help. I was just wondering, so if we're looking at developing some kind of short-term response plan, then yes, like there's already a lot of product like National Weather Service, and there's separate questions as how do I use the National Weather Service product, and is it good enough, and like do we have local measurement to validate them, and what improvement do we need? But if we're looking at decadal prediction, obviously we should be looking at decadal prediction product and looking at like the high resolution modeling the comparison project product. Need to evaluate like the landfall, like tropical storms, the chance for those and different categories. So it seems like I guess based on your answer, this will be very ambitious. It's like we're doing both and we're developing both like short-term response and also what's a guideline for long-term build. I mean, decadal time scale. Okay.
Yeah, let me just clarify that. So at this point in the project, we're considering both, right?
Okay.
But at the end of the project, we've got to pick things that are important, significant, fundable by NSF. So some things may be interesting and important, but not fundable, and so we have to be judicious. Now, that doesn't mean that the NSF proposal is the only end route here. If there's things that come up that are useful and interesting and people want to work on that could be funded by DOE or NOAA, I think this process would advance it, and I would make me very happy. But the primary motivation at the moment is to try and get a team that can win a phase 2 program.
Okay, got you. All right, thank you.
Other questions, comments?
So let me just wrap up, right? So what happens next, right? We're going to summarize what we've heard today and think about it. Then we're going to formulate like a list of topics that include perhaps things that we've talked about today and things that we might add. And then we're going to have those discussed by user groups like town managers, engineers, contractors, and perhaps state agency, permitter types people. We want to get opinions from them on the relative importance of the issues that we've discussed and signs that we might do in the future. And then in parallel, we'll form work groups, which I hope you volunteer for, and there'll be an announcement about what they are and how to participate. And those work groups will refine the science that needs to get done to address the problems that are at the core of the work group task. And that should happen, in the next several months. I put the schedule up earlier, and I'm not looking at it right now because I don't have the slides with me. But I think that our schedule, I think, calls for that to happen like in February through June, something like that. Yeah, and if you have any question, we're also going to put up a website, and there'll be like a way to contact us through that too, or you can just email me, O'Donnell@uconn.edu. It's pretty straightforward. Anyone else want to make some comments?
One more plug for if you are interested in a particular theme, you can go to the mural board that we put in the chat, and put your email down, and we'll be organizing some follow-up discussions, and that will sort of lead into the formation of the working groups. So feel free to do that.
Okay, and I want to plug the Physics of Estuaries and Coastal Seas conference at Portland, Maine in August. So sign up before the end of the month.
I'll put the website in the
Okay.
chat.
That'd be a great idea, Kim. I was going to do that, but I didn't think I was competent enough to do it under pressure. Okay, well, thanks a lot for everyone for participating and for Circuit guys and the PI team for helping organize this. And I look forward to talking to you all again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.